The anniversary cake had 3 tiers: white fondant, gold leaf, and a little sugar bride and groom pressed into the top. 200 guests filled the ballroom of Caspian Vane's coastal estate in Saltmere, Oregon, their laughter bouncing off marble floors and vaulted ceilings strung with crystal chandeliers. The Pacific Ocean roared in the dark beyond floor-to-ceiling windows, swallowing the last amber light of the October sky. Nadia stood in the center of it all in a dress the color of champagne, her natural hair swept up in soft coils, her hands still at her sides. She looked, to anyone watching, like a woman who belonged there. But she had learned, across 2 years of marriage, that looking like you belong somewhere and actually belonging are 2 entirely different things. She scanned the room for Caspian and found him near the fireplace, a glass of scotch in his hand, laughing with a cluster of men. His back was to her. It had been to her for most of the evening. Then came the microphone. Caspian moved to the low stage at the far end of the ballroom with the confidence of a man who had never once doubted his own voice. He was beautiful in the way that dangerous things are beautiful, all clean angles and deliberate charm, his dark suit pressed to perfection, his smile wide enough to make strangers feel chosen. The room quieted for him the way rooms always did. 200 faces turned. Nadia felt the shift of attention move away from her and toward him, and she breathed. She was used to that direction of movement, used to the space he left whenever he stepped forward. 2 years, Caspian said into the microphone, lifting his glass. His eyes swept the room with practiced warmth, landing briefly on Nadia before moving on. Just long enough for the crowd to follow his gaze. Just long enough for her to feel it. 2 years of marriage, he continued, his voice low and theatrical, and I have learned one very important thing. The room leaned in. Someone near the back whispered. Nadia kept her face perfectly smooth. I have learned, Caspian said, tilting his head with a half-smile his guests would later describe as charming, that some people are simply better suited to standing quietly in a beautiful room. The laughter came in a wave, light, uncertain at first, then louder when the guests saw that Caspian was still smiling. He was still smiling when his eyes found Nadia across the space of 50 feet and 200 witnesses. He raised his glass to her. To my wife, he said, who has mastered that particular art. The laughter swelled. It crashed over Nadia like cold water. She felt it on her skin and through her chest and somewhere deep behind her eyes. She did not move. She lifted her own glass. She smiled back at him from across the room, a small, composed smile that gave nothing away, and she drank. Around her, women shifted uncomfortably. Men made jokes to fill the silence. Nadia felt the gaze of 200 strangers pressing against her like something physical. She held her ground. She breathed. She did not break. Not yet. Not here. Not for him. One woman left the crowd. Just one. Yemisi Adiz, in a deep burgundy wrap dress, set her champagne glass on a side table with a quiet click and walked across the ballroom to Nadia's side. She didn't say anything at first. She simply stood there, close enough that their arms touched, warm and solid and real. Yemi had been Nadia's best friend since they were 11 years old on a dusty school bus in Accra. She knew what Nadia's stillness cost her. She knew the difference between composure and survival. Across the room, Caspian had already moved on, accepting congratulations, refilling his glass, letting his hand rest a moment too long on the shoulder of Dahlia Price, who stood at his side in a green silk dress, her lips curved with the private satisfaction of a woman who knows exactly where she stands. Nadia watched that hand. She had been watching that hand for 6 months, every public event, every dinner, every room where Caspian moved like he owned it and Dahlia moved like she was meant to follow. Nadia had never let herself cry about it. Not here. Crying was a luxury she could not yet afford. You okay? Yemi said quietly, her mouth barely moving. The question was meant only for Nadia, buried under the noise of the room, invisible to everyone else. Nadia looked at her oldest friend. At the worry pressed into Yemi's brow. at the quiet fury in her eyes, because Yemi had always been angrier on Nadia's behalf than Nadia was ever allowed to be on her own. "I'm fine," Nadia said. Her voice came out clean and even, which surprised even herself. "He wanted me to cry," she added. "In front of all of them." She let her gaze travel the room, the guests still buzzing with the electric discomfort of having watched something cruel dressed up as a toast. "I'm not going to give him that." Yemi nodded slowly, her jaw tight. "What are you going to give him?" she asked. Nadia set her champagne glass down on the nearest tray. She straightened the line of her dress. She breathed in the salt smell of the ocean coming through the cracked terrace window and felt the cold Pacific air on her cheek, and she thought about the manila envelope locked in the safe in her bedroom 6 days ago. She almost smiled. "Everything he deserves," she said. Nobody noticed when Nadia slipped out onto the stone terrace overlooking the water. The night was clear and deeply cold, the kind of October cold that settles in the bones. Below, the Pacific churned black and endless against the Saltmere cliff, and the wind came off it with teeth, tugging at the soft coils of Nadia's hair and pressing the champagne fabric of her dress against her legs. She stood at the stone railing and looked out at the ocean and let herself feel all of it. The humiliation in front of 200 people. The sound of laughter shaped like a knife. The sight of Dahlia Price's hand brushing Caspian's arm. The 2 years of small, quiet erasures. The opinions she had stopped sharing because he talked over them, the plans she had abandoned because he undermined them, the friends who had drifted away because Caspian had a way of making the people around Nadia feel that she was unworthy of their time. She let herself feel all of it, and then she breathed it out, cold and white, into the October dark. She had not come this far to break tonight. She had come this far to be ready. There was a document in Nadia's safe, one Caspian did not know about, one that changed everything, and she had spent 6 months building toward the moment she would use it. She had not moved yet because the timing was not right. Because in games like the one Caspian Vane played, patience was not weakness. Patience was a weapon. Behind her, the ballroom noise swelled through the glass doors, music lifting, voices brightening, the party recovering its rhythm the way parties always do after something uncomfortable. Caspian was in there, performing generosity for his guests, topping up glasses, telling the story of the Vane family empire to men who already knew it by heart. He was in every outward way winning. She turned from the railing. The ocean roared below. She walked back to the glass doors and pressed her palm flat against the cold surface and looked through it at the glittering, shifting world inside, at her husband's back, at Dahlia's smile, at the guests who had laughed. Then she pushed the door open and walked back in, straight-spined, unhurried, and completely, dangerously calm. 2 years before the anniversary party, Nadia Osei had been living in a 2-bedroom flat in Accra's Lab 1 district, working as a freelance legal translator for international NGOs and spending her evenings on a small balcony with a cup of Milo and a worn paperback. She was not the kind of woman who announced herself. She moved quietly through the world, carrying her intelligence the way some people carry a passport, present always, but rarely produced. At 28, she had lived briefly in London and briefly in Toronto before returning to Ghana after her father's death, to be near her mother and her grandmother, Mama Abina, who was 91 years old and still grew chili pepper in clay pots on her front porch in Kita. Nadia had a wide, open face and a stillness about her that some people mistook for shyness and others mistook for depth. Both were partially true. What was entirely true was that she was not looking for Caspian Vane. She had been perfectly, quietly content in the ordinary smallness of her life when he walked into a room and found her. Caspian Vane had been looking for her for nearly 8 months before they met. Not for Nadia specifically, not at first. He had been looking for the land. The Osei coastal land in Kita, a long narrow strip of shoreline on the south coast of Ghana, had been in Nadia's family for 4 generations. At first glance, it appeared to be nothing more than a stretch of flat, scrubby coastline with coconut palms and fishing nets and red-brown sand. But the Saltmere Pacific Development Group, Caspian's investment consortium had been commissioned by luxury hotel developers who wanted 300 meters of that exact shoreline for a boutique eco-resort project expected to generate $80 million in its first decade. The problem was that the most valuable 300 meters of the Osei shoreline were not, technically, the Osei family's land. Mama Abina, in her particular and private wisdom, had transferred that strip of coastline into the name of her eldest granddaughter, Nadia, 12 years earlier. A legal transfer. Registered. Binding. And Caspian's lawyer had found it buried in a Ghanaian land registry document during routine due diligence. That was the moment Caspian Vane had started looking for Nadia Osei. A mutual acquaintance made the introduction at a gallery opening in East Legon 4 months after Caspian arrived in Accra under the pretense of a broader African investment tour. The gallery was small and warm, smelling of white wine and new paint, and Nadia had been standing in front of a large blue abstract canvas when a man said, quietly and unexpectedly, "You look like you're actually looking at it. Most people here are only looking at each other." She turned. He was tall, with the kind of precise good looks that suggested effort, jaw clean-shaven, dark hair combed back, shoulders filling his jacket exactly right. His name was Caspian. He said it once, simply, the way people say things they know will be remembered. He asked what she thought of the painting. She told him. He listened, and this was the thing that would haunt her later. He listened with his whole body turned toward her, as though what she said mattered in a way that things rarely mattered to him. She did not know then that he had practiced this quality of listening for years, that it was as deliberate as his jacket, that she was already in his plan. He courted her for 6 weeks with a patience that should, in hindsight, have told her something. Men like Caspian Vane, men who commanded rooms, who flew between cities on private schedules, who had assistants managing their silences, did not court quietly. They did not show up at small bookshops with takeaway jollof rice and a paperback they'd bought because she mentioned the author once. They did not walk slowly along the Labadi beachfront at sunset asking thoughtful questions about her grandmother. They did not sit on the low wall outside her flat at 11 at night talking about their fathers. But Caspian did all of this. He performed warmth with a craftsman's precision, and Nadia, who had spent most of her adult life being overlooked in rooms where louder women sparkled, felt something she was not used to feeling. She felt seen. She felt chosen. She did not yet understand that being chosen can be the most dangerous thing that happens to a woman when the man doing the choosing has already decided what she is worth, and it has nothing to do with her. Her mother knew. Efua Osei, a small, angular woman who had buried one husband and raised 3 daughters on a combination of teacher's salary and careful thrift, took one long look at Caspian at Sunday lunch and said nothing for the entire meal. Afterward, washing dishes in the kitchen while Caspian sat in the sitting room making Nadia's youngest sister laugh, Efua pressed a sudsy hand to Nadia's wrist and said, "He is looking at the house more than at you." Nadia had laughed it off. "You're seeing things that aren't there, Mama," she said. But her mother's hand tightened on her wrist. "When a man wants something from you," Efua said quietly, her eyes serious and dark, "he will first make you feel like the most important thing in the room. Learn to ask what the room contains." Nadia had smiled and called it mother's nerves. She had told herself that Efua was simply unused to men who were attentive. She had told herself a great many things in those 6 weeks, and none of them were entirely wrong, and none of them were entirely right, and by the time the truth came she was already wearing his ring. They married in a civil ceremony in Accra in February, 3 months after they met, fast, the way Caspian did everything when the deal was already decided. Nadia wore a fitted ivory dress and small gold earrings that had belonged to her grandmother. The ceremony was at a registrar's office in Ridge, attended only by her mother, her 2 sisters, Yemi, and 3 of Caspian's business associates who arrived and departed like men with other appointments. There was no church, no reception with dancing until morning. Caspian had called it romantic, intimate, he said, private. Just us and the people who matter. And Nadia, who had never wanted a loud wedding, had agreed. What she noticed but dismissed that afternoon was the way Caspian's attorney arrived 15 minutes into the post-ceremony lunch with a manila envelope and a fountain pen. Land transfer signatures, Caspian explained, touching her hand. Just some estate management paperwork. My lawyer is overly punctual. She had signed 3 documents without reading them. 3. And his attorney had slid the papers back into the envelope with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose afternoon had gone exactly according to plan. That night, in a boutique hotel in Aburi where they spent 2 nights before flying to Saltmere, Nadia stood at the window looking out at the dark shapes of trees against the night hillside and felt something settle over her that she could not name. Not dread. Not exactly. More like the feeling of a door closing behind you in a room you have not yet had the chance to look at. Caspian had made a call from the other room, quick, professional, his voice dropping to a low register she would come to recognize as the voice he used when the performance was not required. She had not heard the words. Only the tone. Calm, satisfied. The tone of a transaction completed. She had told herself he was a businessman and businessmen make calls even on wedding nights. She had turned from the window and gotten into bed and waited, and when he came in his face had rearranged itself back into warmth, back into attentiveness, and she had let herself believe in that face. She would spend the next 2 years learning the cost of that belief. Saltmere, Oregon was the kind of place that looked, at first, like a gift. The Vane estate sat on a bluff above the Pacific. A sprawling modernist house of dark cedar and glass that caught the ocean light like a lens. The rooms were wide and pale, white walls, stone floors, furniture the color of driftwood. From the master bedroom you could see water in 3 directions, and the sound of it was constant, a low continuous conversation between the cliff and the sea. Nadia had arrived in late February, when the Oregon coast is still locked in winter gray, and she had stood in the center of the main room with her 1 suitcase and looked around at the beautiful, expensive emptiness of it and tried to feel that she was home. The estate had a housekeeper named Mrs. Birch, a tall, bony woman from Coos Bay who had worked for the Vane family for 11 years and who greeted Nadia with a professional smile and eyes that assessed and categorized with a speed that felt almost clinical. Mrs. Vane, she said. The name sat strange on Nadia's skin. Welcome to the estate. The first erasure was small enough that Nadia almost missed it. 3 weeks in, she had arranged a small study in the East Wing, a room with south-facing light that came in warm all morning, good for her translation work. She organized her books, set up her laptop, and pinned a laminated map of West Africa to the wall beside the window. She had been quietly happy in that particular way that comes from making a corner of the world your own. Then she came back from a walk one afternoon to find the study reassigned. Caspian had spoken to Mrs. Birch about converting the East Wing room to a guest suite for visiting business associates coming next month. The books had been boxed. The map had been removed. The laptop was on the kitchen counter. It's a better room for guests, Caspian said when she raised it. He was not unkind. He was reasonable, measured, already moving on to another thought. She had no argument that seemed large enough to matter. She found another room. A smaller one, north-facing, where the light never quite arrived. Caspian traveled frequently. This she had known going in. He had appeared to be honest about it. What she had not understood was the particular quality of his absences. When he was gone, the estate contracted around her. Mrs. Birch managed the house with cold efficiency and spoke to Nadia only about practical matters, menus, deliveries, maintenance schedules, in a tone that communicated, without ever saying it directly, that the real authority in this house resided with the man who was not currently in it. Nadia had tried, in the first months, to build a life in Saltmere beyond the estate walls. She found a small cafe in town where she could work, a library with a reasonable West African literature collection, a yoga studio she went to twice a week. But Saltmere was Caspian's town in a way she had not anticipated. The Vane name was on 2 buildings, a foundation, and the annual arts festival. People knew who she was only because of who she had married. Without Caspian present, she was a placeholder. A name attached to a name. She began to understand that she had moved to a place where she existed only in relation to him. Dahlia Price had been in Caspian's life longer than Nadia, though this was something Nadia would only fully understand much later. At first Dahlia appeared simply as a professional presence, Caspian's lead project director for the Pacific Coast Development Portfolio, a sharp woman in her mid-30s who visited the estate 3 or 4 times in the first year under the context of business. She wore her hair short and her opinions loudly, and she had the easy confidence of someone who has never once wondered whether she belongs in a room. She and Caspian spoke in the shorthand of people who have worked together for years. Quick references, shared jokes, a communication frequency explained as professional necessity. Nadia had not immediately suspected anything beyond professional closeness. It was the small things that accumulated, Dahlia's hand on Caspian's sleeve, a habit of touching too fluid to be deliberate. The way Caspian's posture changed when Dahlia walked in. The way he never mentioned her when they spoke privately. The things we notice but don't name because naming them requires a courage we're not yet ready to spend. By the end of the first year, Nadia had stopped calling her friends back home as often as she once had. Not because she wanted to, but because the calls had taken on a texture she couldn't sustain. Her sisters asked questions she couldn't answer truthfully. Yemi pressed gently but persistently, and Nadia was not yet ready to give Yemi's worry any fuel. Her mother called every Sunday, and every Sunday Nadia assembled a version of her life that was not quite a lie. She said the coast was beautiful, which was true. She said Caspian was busy, which was true. She said she was finding her footing, which was also, in its way, true. What she did not say, that she had begun to feel, in this white-walled house above the sea, a strange and growing blankness. Not sadness exactly, but a kind of dimming, as if the parts of herself she had relied on to feel like Nadia were being slowly, systematically turned off. The translation work had dried up. She had stopped pitching for contracts. Caspian had suggested, mildly and only once, that it was unseemly for a vain wife to take freelance work. She had not argued. She did not know yet how to argue with something that wore the shape of a suggestion. The second year was harder. Caspian had grown less careful with his performance. The warmth he had deployed so precisely during their courtship had not disappeared entirely. It appeared at public events, in the way he touched her shoulder in front of his mother. But at home, in the private interior of the estate, there was a temperature to him that Nadia had no word for. Not cold, exactly. Indifferent would be closer. He looked at her sometimes with something that was almost a calculation. A quick, assessing glance, like a man checking the status of something he had already purchased and did not currently need. He criticized with the precision of a person who has identified every vulnerable point and applies pressure only enough to remind you that he can. Her cooking, her friends, her choice of reading material, once, with a light contempt that was over before she could respond. He never raised his voice. He never needed to. The particular cruelty of Caspian Vein was that it was always deniable. Always reasonable. Always just enough to make her doubt whether she had heard what she had heard. And yet she stayed. This is the part that people would later struggle to understand. Why a woman with a graduate degree and a grandmother's land and a best friend in Accra would stay in a marriage that had become, quietly, a kind of daily diminishment. The answer was layered, as these answers always are. She stayed because she had no proof yet, only the slow accumulation of small violences that left no marks. She stayed because leaving felt like admitting she had been fooled, and the shame of that felt larger than the marriage. She stayed because her mother had warned her and she had not listened, and going home meant bearing that weight in her mother's eyes. She stayed because she had not yet understood the full shape of what had been done to her, that this was not a marriage that had gone wrong, but a marriage that had been constructed to go wrong by a man who had selected her precisely because she was the kind of person who would endure. But something was changing. Something had been changing for 6 months, ever since the afternoon she opened a document on Caspian's desk by accident and read 8 words that changed the entire map of her life. It had been an ordinary Thursday in March, 10 months before the anniversary party, when Nadia changed. Caspian had been away in Portland for the week, a development consortium meeting that would run through the weekend. The estate was quiet in the particular way it only was when Mrs. Birch had taken her day off and Nadia had the house entirely to herself. She had been in Caspian's study looking for a phone charger. Her own had broken, and she remembered seeing a spare in the top drawer of his desk. The drawer was unlocked. Inside, beneath miscellaneous cables and a small leather notepad, was a manila folder, and the folder had been left open to the middle, and the page it was open to was a memorandum between Caspian's lawyer and the Saltmere Pacific Development Group, dated the previous month. Nadia had not intended to read it. She reached in for the charger, and her eyes snagged on a single line of text. 8 words. She stood still in that study for a long, suspended moment while the world reorganized itself around those 8 words. The land transfer was executed on the day of marriage. She read them again, and she began to understand. She took the folder to the small north-facing room that was now her office and spread every document on the desk in the gray morning light and read each one carefully, with the focused attention she had once applied to legal translation. Slow, precise, looking for both what the words said and what they were designed not to say. The picture assembled itself with terrible clarity. The Osei Kita shoreline, 318 meters of Ghanaian coastline that Mama Abina had transferred to Nadia's name 12 years earlier, had been co-signed over to the Saltmere Pacific Development Group on the day of the civil marriage ceremony in Accra. The 3 documents she had signed at the post-ceremony lunch, without reading, while Caspian touched her hand and called them estate management paperwork. A transfer instrument. A beneficial interest declaration. A power of attorney. She had signed 3 documents that collectively surrendered legal control of her grandmother's land to her husband's company. The development consortium had been waiting. Caspian's attorney had received confirmation before Nadia had finished her wedding lunch. The eco-resort project had been in planning stages for 11 months before Caspian walked into the East Legan Gallery and said, gently, that she looked like a woman who was actually looking at the painting. She sat with this knowledge for 3 days before she did anything with it. She put the folder back exactly as she had found it. She even photographed the position of each document with her phone before lifting them, so she could replace them precisely. She went through the rest of the week in the same way she always did. She cooked, she read, she took her daily walk along the cliff path, she called her mother on Sunday and assembled her usual version of her life. She did not cry. She was beyond crying. What she felt was something quieter and sharper than grief, the sensation of a very large and very complex thing finally becoming visible, like the moment a fog lifts and you see for the first time the full size of the landscape you have been standing in. She had been chosen carefully, courted precisely, married quickly. She had signed the papers before she even had a ring on her finger 12 hours. She had been delivered to Caspian's door by a system so well designed that she had felt, every step of the way, like she was making her own choices. The rage came in waves. She let it. Then she sat down and she started making a list. The list began with what she knew, the land transfer, the 3 documents, the dates. Then it expanded into what she needed to know, whether the transfer was legally complete, whether Ghanaian land law had provisions she could use, whether the power of attorney could be challenged on grounds of non-disclosure, and what the development consortium's projected timeline was. She was careful and methodical. She worked only on her personal laptop with a new browser profile and a VPN she installed on her phone. She created a new email address from a public Wi-Fi connection at the coffee shop in town. She contacted, through a referral from a Lagos-based NGO colleague, a Ghanaian land law attorney named Kwame Asante, whose firm specialized in cross-border property disputes. She sent Kwame photographs of all 3 documents, the transfer instrument, the beneficial interest declaration, the power of attorney, along with a detailed timeline and a single question. On the information provided, is any part of this transfer legally challengeable? Kwame's response came back in 4 days. The second paragraph contained a sentence that Nadia read 3 times and then folded carefully into a place inside her chest where she kept the things that mattered most. It read, "There is more here than you may currently be aware of. We need to speak." She called Kwame from the cafe on a Tuesday morning, her coffee going cold beside her, the sound of the ocean just audible through the window. He was a careful, precise man. She could hear it in the methodical way he organized his sentences. He told her that the power of attorney she had signed, while on its surface granting Caspian's company rights over the Kita land, had a structural flaw. The document had been drafted under Ghanaian legal framework but executed without the presence of a Ghanaian legal witness, a requirement under the specific land registry provision that applied to Mama Abina's original transfer. The flaw was minor. It would not on its own invalidate the transfer, but it created a challengeable crack. And there was something else. He asked her if she was aware that Mama Abina had amended her original land transfer document in the final year of her life. Nadia had not known this. Kwame told her that Mama Abina, with the legal assistance of a solicitor in Kita, had added a rider clause to the original transfer, specifying that the land could not be transferred or co-signed out of Nadia's sole beneficial ownership without the witness signature of a named individual. The named individual was Efua Osei, Nadia's mother. She pressed her hand to her mouth. Mama Abina had known. That was the thought that sat at the center of everything else, expanding outward like a stone dropped in still water. Her grandmother, 91 years old, growing pepper in clay pots, calling Nadia on her birthday to recite the names of everyone who had ever loved her, had known that land and women were both things that men tried to take, and she had built a wall around her granddaughter's inheritance with the particular quiet intelligence of a woman who had survived long enough to understand how power works. The rider clause meant that Caspian's transfer was incomplete. The power of attorney was structurally flawed. And the beneficial interest declaration was, according to Kwame, challengeable on the basis that Nadia had not been informed of the true nature of what she was signing, a form of fraudulent misrepresentation under Ghanaian contract law. He could not promise the outcome, but he could begin building the case. He needed 3 things: time, documentation, and silence. Nadia could give him all 3. She ended the call and sat for a long moment with her hands flat on the table, looking at the cold surface of her coffee. She was thinking about Mama Abina. She was thinking about her mother's voice in a kitchen, years ago, "Learn to ask what the room contains." She walked home from the cafe in the raw March wind with her coat pulled tight and her mind arranged around the new shape of everything. She had been married to a man who had planned her from 8 months out, who had selected her for her softness, her quietness, her uncomplicated gratitude for being chosen, who had courted her with borrowed warmth and married her before she had time to read 3 documents, who had moved her 5,000 miles from everyone who loved her to an estate where she existed only in relation to him. She had been chosen to be broken. She understood this now with a clarity that was almost a relief, because there is a particular kind of freedom that comes from knowing the full truth of a thing, even when the truth is terrible. She knew now what she was dealing with. She knew now what was at stake. And she knew something Caspian Vane did not know, that his plan had a flaw. That her grandmother had loved her in a way that reached forward into this exact moment. That she was not as alone as he had designed her to be. She walked up the cliff path to the white-walled house, pushed open the door, and smiled at Mrs. Birch. She was already planning. The months between March and September were the hardest of Nadia's life, not because she had lost her plan, but because she had to carry it alone inside a situation specifically designed to isolate her. Caspian did not know what she had found. She was certain of this. She had replaced the folder precisely, and she watched him carefully for any sign of suspicion and found none. He looked at her the same way he always did, assessing, mildly contemptuous, occasionally warm in the performance sense, and she held herself still under his gaze and showed him nothing. But silence has its own weight, and the plan she was building required patience that pressed against every instinct she had. The development consortium's timeline was moving. Kwame had confirmed that the eco-resort planning permission had been submitted. Caspian needed the land transfer finalized, fully and cleanly, to proceed. At some point she would be asked to sign something else. Or he would notice the gap in the original paperwork and find another way around it. She had months, perhaps less. She needed to move without appearing to move. She needed to stay without giving anything away. He escalated in April. Not dramatically. Caspian never did anything dramatically, because drama left evidence. But she noticed a tightening of the small cruelties, a precision to the way he applied them that told her something had shifted in his own calculation. He began to invite business associates to the estate more frequently, filling the house with men who spoke over her at dinner and looked through her at cocktail hour. He discussed her in front of her, not cruelly, but in the third person, as if she were a feature of the estate rather than a person in the room. He mentioned her phone once, left open on the counter, with a text thread visible. She did not read far enough to confirm what she had already suspected, because she could not afford, right now, the particular kind of grief that confirmation would require. She had arranged her life into compartments. The plan lived in one. Everything else, the loneliness, the anger, the long nights lying awake listening to the ocean, lived in another. She could not afford to let them touch. The friends went one by one, and this was the thing Nadia had not prepared for, the gradual, mechanical quality of it. Her Saltmere acquaintances, the yoga studio friends, the cafe regulars, the woman from the library book club who had invited Nadia to 3 dinners before giving up, had withdrawn in a way that was too consistent to be accidental. She would only understand later that Caspian had a method, a well-placed word at a fundraiser, a mild suggestion of instability, a raised eyebrow when someone asked how Nadia was doing. He never said anything specific. He never needed to. He was skilled at the kind of social management that operates in the space between words. By spring of the second year, her world in Saltmere had contracted to the estate, the cliff path, the cafe, and her phone. She called Yemi every Sunday, and Yemi's voice on those calls was the one thing that felt like solid ground. Yemi, who asked real questions and refused comfortable answers. Yemi, who said on a March evening quietly and directly, "Tell me the actual truth, Nads. Not the version." And Nadia, who had been saving this up for months, told her. It took 2 hours and a second cup of tea on Yemi's end and several long silences during which Nadia could hear her best friend breathing through the shock of it. She told Yemi about the folder, about the 3 documents, about Kwame, about Mama Abina's rider clause, about the development consortium and the eco-resort and the 8 months of deliberate courtship and the 3 documents signed at her own wedding lunch. She did not cry while telling it. She had already moved through the crying stage and out the other side into something harder and quieter. Yemi was silent for a long moment at the end. Then she said, "Your grandmother put your mother's name on it." "Yes," Nadia said. "Your mother doesn't know." "No." Another long silence. Then, "What do you need from me?" And this was why Yemi was the one person Caspian had not been able to remove from Nadia's life. Because Yemi had never once in 30 years of friendship wasted a moment on questions that were about herself. She had asked exactly the right thing, and Nadia had told her exactly what she needed, and from that Sunday forward, Yemi became the second pillar of a plan that now had weight and shape and motion. She called her mother in early April, on a Sunday evening when Caspian was in Seattle. Her mother answered on the second ring, as always, her voice carrying that particular combination of warmth and precision that Nadia had inherited and only recently learned to trust in herself. "Mama," Nadia said, "I need to talk to you about Mama Abina's land." The silence on the other end lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Efua Osei said, in the voice she used when she was managing something large and painful, "I have been waiting for this call." It turned out that Efua had known about the rider clause for years. She had been present the day the amendment was made, had sat in the small office in Quito with the solicitor while Mama Abina, steady-handed and clear-eyed at the age of 88, had dictated the precise language she wanted. The land cannot leave Nadia's sole control without my Fua's signed witness. Fua had not spoken of it because Mama Abina had asked her to wait, to say nothing until it was needed. Your grandmother said, she will know when it's time, Fua told her. Nadia pressed her fist to her mouth. Outside, the Pacific roared. It was time. June brought a development that changed Nadia's calculation. Caspian came home from a Portland meeting in a contained temper, visible to her now in the specific way that tension lived in his jaw and the set of his shoulders. Over dinner he mentioned, with studied casualness, that the land registry in Ghana had flagged an irregularity in the documentation. His attorney was handling it. Nothing to worry about. He said it while cutting his steak, his eyes on his plate, his voice perfectly level. She agreed it sounded manageable and asked if he wanted more wine and watched from behind her neutrality as he processed something he was not saying. He did not know she had spoken to Kwame. He did not know she had spoken to her mother. He did not know that Kwame had, 6 weeks earlier, formally registered a legal challenge to the transfer instrument on grounds of fraudulent misrepresentation and procedural irregularity, a challenge that would not appear in any correspondence addressed to Nadia's Saltmere address, because Kwame sent everything to Yemi's address in Accra. The irregularity Caspian's lawyer had flagged was Kwame's challenge. It had begun. Under the table, Nadia's hands were completely still. By September she was ready. Not emotionally, she would never be fully ready for what it cost to stand up inside a life you had built and dismantle it. But practically she was ready. She had the documents. She had Kwame. She had her mother. She had Yemi. She had a recording she had been careful to save, a call in which Caspian, speaking to his attorney and apparently certain she was not home, discussed the timeline for the secondary signature extraction, referring to Nadia in precisely those terms. Extraction. Not ask. Not request. Extract. As if she were a resource from which something was to be taken. She had stored the recording along with every document and photograph in 3 locations. With Kwame, with a Portland attorney Yemi had found through a legal aid contact, and with Fua Osei in a padded envelope in a kitchen drawer in Accra. The manila envelope she had locked in the estate safe, the one that now sat behind the family jewelry and Caspian's passport copies, contained only one thing, a single letter, dated September 12th, formally rescinding the power of attorney on grounds already filed with the Ghanaian Land Registry. She was waiting for him to make the move that would make her response undeniable. He was about to. October. 2 weeks before the anniversary party. Caspian came home from a Seattle trip and for the first time in their marriage, he was careless. Nadia heard it before she saw it. A laugh from the lower hallway, female and easy, the kind of laugh that does not bother to lower itself because it has forgotten that the house belongs to someone else. She was at the top of the stairs with a book. She stopped. Below, in the entry hall, Caspian was setting down his bag and Dahlia Price was standing 3 feet behind him, still in her coat, an overnight bag at her feet. 2 bags. 1 trip. The math was silent and complete. Mrs. Birch appeared from the kitchen corridor with the composed efficiency of someone who had been expecting this arrangement. Mrs. Birch, the East guest suite for Miss Price. Caspian's voice was perfectly natural. He looked up and saw Nadia on the stairs and held her gaze for 1 second, assessing as always, and then said, "Nadia, you remember Dahlia. Development meeting ran over. She'll be with us a few days." 3 days. In the East guest suite. The room that had once, briefly, been Nadia's study. She did not make a scene. She understood by now that making a scene was precisely what he was testing. Every move Caspian made had a purpose, and the purpose of Dahlia Price in this house for 3 days was to measure how much Nadia would endure, to map the boundaries of her tolerance, to see if she was still manageable. She greeted Dahlia with composure, offered tea, showed her the guest room's attached bathroom. She felt Dahlia's eyes on her the entire time. A quick, intelligent assessment. The look of a woman who is deciding whether what she has been told about the wife matches the woman she is seeing. What Dahlia had been told, Nadia had pieced this together over months, was that Nadia was quiet, compliant, mildly dim, not a person to concern yourself with. The look Dahlia gave her at the door of the East guest suite suggested she was revising this. Nadia handed her a fresh towel and said the water pressure in this bathroom was better than the other guest rooms. She said it lightly and moved away and did not look back. She heard Dahlia's silence behind her as she walked down the corridor. Some people are only dangerous when underestimated. And Nadia had been underestimated for 2 years. The 3 days were an exercise in studied performance. Nadia's and Caspian's, parallel and opposed. He had the air of a man enjoying a game he believed he was winning. He included Dahlia in conversations from which Nadia was excluded, business discussions at the dinner table that moved too fast for interruption, inside references to projects and colleagues Nadia was not part of. He once, mid-sentence in a conversation with Dahlia, answered a question Nadia had just asked him by saying, "Not now," with the patient firmness of someone managing a child's interruption. Dahlia had the grace to look briefly away. Nadia had smiled and returned to her food. On the second evening she knocked on Dahlia's door and, when Dahlia opened it, handed her a sealed, addressed envelope and said, "I found this in the entryway. I think you dropped it coming in." She had not found it in the entryway. She had written it herself, 2 weeks earlier, as part of a plan she had discussed with Kwame. The envelope contained a single page, a list of questions about the land transfer, phrased as if from a confused and slightly anxious wife, addressed to Dahlia in her capacity as project director. Dahlia's written answer, Kwame had told her, could be legally significant. Dahlia opened the envelope. Nadia knew this because she heard the rustle of paper from the corridor. She walked quietly away and did not wait for a response. Later that night she heard Dahlia's voice, quick, low, and then silence, and then a door. In the morning Dahlia was gone. Bag, coat, presents. Gone before breakfast. Caspian came down to find Nadia reading at the kitchen table and the east wing silent. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. For the first time, there was a look on his face she did not have a name for, not anger, but something adjacent to it. She looked up from her book. "She had an early flight," he said. It wasn't a question. "I suppose she did," Nadia said and turned the page. She could feel him standing there, recalculating. She had felt him recalculating for weeks, small pauses, longer looks, the specific quality of attention directed at her when he sensed something had moved and he wasn't sure what. She had been careful not to confirm his suspicions. She was still playing the long game. But the envelope, delivered to Dahlia with the bland helpfulness of a quiet wife, had done exactly what it was designed to do. Dahlia now knew that questions were being asked. November brought Caspian's mother. Leonora Vane arrived at the Saltmere estate in a hired car from Portland with 3 pieces of luggage and the unhurried energy of a woman who had long ago stopped requiring anyone's permission. She was in her late 60s, elegant, silver-haired, with Caspian's eyes but a different quality to them, something more direct and less managed. She had visited twice before, briefly and formally, and in those visits she and Nadia had maintained a polite distance sustained by good manners on both sides and very little else. This visit was different. Caspian was in Seattle again, and Leonora arrived into Nadia's day the way weather arrives, without announcement, rearranging the atmosphere. She stood in the entry hall and took in the house and then looked at Nadia with a directness that was almost a shock after 2 years of being looked through. "You've done nothing with this place," she said. "It still looks like a showroom." Nadia, surprised into honesty, said, "It's not my house." Leonora was quiet for a moment. Then she set down her bag. "Pour me tea," she said. "The kind your grandmother would make. Not the pale water my son prefers. Then come and sit down." They sat in the large kitchen with the afternoon light coming gray and flat off the ocean, and Leonora drank her tea and looked at Nadia with a patience that felt, unexpectedly, like the first genuine attention anyone in this house had ever paid her. She asked about Mama Abina, about Accra, about the translation work Nadia had done before the marriage. She asked with the particular quality of curiosity that is not performance but genuine hunger for information, asking follow-up questions, shaping the conversation with the intelligence of someone who has spent a lifetime reading people and knows what it costs them not to be read. Nadia was careful. She had not yet decided how much to trust Leonora. But Leonora, who had been watching her son for 67 years, had a way of creating openings that were hard to close. "He married you for the land," Leonora said, without preamble, at the end of the second cup of tea. She said it the way you say something you have been carrying for a long time and are finally setting down. "I didn't know until after the engagement. He showed me the land registry documents afterward." She paused. "I said nothing. That is the thing I am most ashamed of." Nadia said nothing. She held the warmth of the teacup between both hands and let Leonora's words sit in the kitchen air. "He has always used things," Leonora said quietly. Her voice had the texture of someone choosing honesty over comfort, which is always harder. "I made him that way in part. His father and we showed him that acquisition was the measure of a man. I didn't know what he'd become when I wasn't looking." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the ocean moved under the gray sky. "I'm telling you this because I think you already know," Leonora said, "and because I think you are not the kind of woman who is going to simply absorb this and move on. Am I wrong?" Nadia looked at her for a long moment. She thought about Kwame. She thought about the envelope in her safe. She thought about her mother's voice and Yemi's steady presence. She thought about Mama Abina's hands in clay-red soil, growing peppers with the patience of someone who knew that what you plant carefully will survive almost anything. "No," she said. "You're not wrong." Leonora nodded. She did not ask what Nadia was planning. She simply picked up her cup and said quietly, "Good." And the kitchen was quiet, and the ocean was loud, and something shifted between them that could not be shifted back. The anniversary party had been Caspian's idea. 6 months into the year of planning, she was now deep inside. Nadia had understood this. The anniversary party was not a celebration. It was a demonstration. Caspian had been applying pressure on her since August in ways she felt but could not yet name. The toast that humiliated her in front of 200 guests had been his strongest move yet, a public test of her capacity to absorb. But the party had also been, for her, a calculated opportunity. She had needed him in public, in front of witnesses, making the kind of moves he made when he felt secure. And he had delivered. The toast, the contempt dressed as humor, Dahlia Price in green silk at his elbow, all of it witnessed, most of it captured by 3 people Nadia had specifically invited for this purpose. Yemi, who had flown in from Accra and was standing near the catering table with her phone angled at the stage. A journalist named Marcus Obi who covered West African business news and who Nadia had briefed through Kwame's introduction. And a Portland attorney named Selin Aden, who had been moving unobtrusively through the crowd all evening with a set of notarized documents in her clutch bag. What Caspian announced at the end of the evening, after the guests had thinned and the band had moved into the slow late-night repertoire and the champagne had been replaced by brandy, was not a surprise to Nadia. She had predicted it within a 3-week window, and she had been right. He came to her on the terrace, where she had moved after his toast to stand in the cold ocean air, and he stood beside her at the stone railing and looked out at the water with the posture of a man delivering something he has rehearsed but has chosen to present as spontaneous. "I think you know this has run its course," he said. "I've had my attorney draw up separation papers. They're generous. The Saltmere house is yours until the new year. A settlement that covers your return to Accra and a year's living expenses. Clean, Nadia. No difficulty." He was offering her an exit that also quietly closed every legal option she actually had. A settlement that required her signature on a document that would, buried in its legal language, relinquish all claims to the land transfer dispute. She had seen the draft version 3 weeks earlier. Kwame had flagged it. "That's very thorough," she said, looking at the ocean. "Your attorney always is." He turned to look at her. She felt it. the small recalibration in his attention that happened when she said something he hadn't expected. "I need you to sign before the end of the month," he said. His voice was still even, still patient, but the month deadline had not been in the draft Kwame had reviewed. The timeline was moving faster than she had anticipated. She understood now what the deadline meant. Caspian had received a legal notice. The challenge was becoming visible. He needed her signature on the settlement, the one that would quietly close the dispute, before the Ghanaian process reached a decisive stage. He was even now still managing her, still operating on the assumption that she was the quiet, compliant woman he had designed. She turned from the ocean to face him. The terrace light caught the angles of his face, beautiful and deliberate, exactly as it had always been, in a gallery in East Legon what felt like several lifetimes ago. "I'll need to have it reviewed by my own attorney," she said. She said it simply, without drama, the way you say something that has always been true. The look that moved across his face in the half-second before he controlled it was worth every month of waiting. She told Yemi that night, in whispers, standing in the kitchen with their shoes off and the house quiet around them. Yemi had flown in for the anniversary party under the pretense of a casual visit, which Caspian had accepted with the mild contempt he reserved for anyone who belonged to Nadia rather than to him. She told Yemi about the deadline. Yemi told her that Marcus Obi had captured the toast on video and was holding it pending her instruction. She told Yemi that Selin Aiden needed 48 hours to file the Portland countermotion, a legal response to the settlement offer that would introduce the settlement document into the land dispute proceedings as evidence of coercion. 48 hours. They were past the point of patience now. They were in the territory of timing. Yemi sat on the kitchen counter with her bare feet swinging and her eyes sharp and said, "You've been holding this for 8 months. Almost," Nadia said. "Since March." Yemi was quiet for a moment. "Your grandmother knew," she said finally. It wasn't a question. Nadia nodded. The night was very quiet. Outside the glass, the Pacific moved endlessly against the cliff, and Nadia thought about an old woman in Kita, growing peppers, looking forward through time with the long, patient vision of someone who loves beyond their own lifetime. The next morning, Caspian left for Portland before 8, which was what Nadia had anticipated and which was why Selin Aiden was at the estate gate at 8:15. Nadia let her in. They sat at the kitchen table with every document spread across its surface in the gray October morning light, and Selin walked her through each step of what was about to happen with the calm precision of someone who has done this before and who has spent 30 years ensuring that the women on the right side of these proceedings understand exactly what they have built. The Portland countermotion would be filed by noon. The Ghanaian legal challenge would reach its preliminary judgment stage the following week. Kwame had confirmed the timing. The recording of Caspian's call to his attorney, the one where he referred to the secondary signature extraction, was now filed with both proceedings. The settlement offer, with its buried land dispute clause, would be introduced as evidence in both jurisdictions. By the time Caspian received the Portland filing notification, there would be simultaneous proceedings in 2 countries, and the eco-resort project would be frozen pending resolution of the land dispute. $80 million held. The development consortium would not be pleased. Caspian's position inside it, which depended entirely on his ability to deliver the land, would become untenable. Selin left at 10. Nadia walked the cliff path alone in the flat, cold light, the same path she had walked hundreds of times, in all weathers, mostly alone. The ocean was rough and the wind came off it horizontal, carrying salt and cold and the smell of deep water. She walked slowly, her hands in her coat pockets, her hair loose and pulled by the wind, and she thought about all the mornings she had walked this path with the weight of what she knew pressing against the inside of her chest. She thought about her north-facing office, her boxed books, her removed map. She thought about the 3 documents signed at a wedding lunch. She thought about Mrs. Birch's professional smile and Dahlia Price's measured look and Caspian's voice on the terrace the previous night delivering her exit as if it were a gift. She thought about her mother in a kitchen in Accra saying learn to ask what the room contains. And she thought about what the room had always contained, more than Caspian knew, more than he had planned for, more than his beautiful, deliberate system had accounted for. It had contained Mama Abina. It had contained Efua Osei. It had contained Yemi. It had contained Nadia herself. He had built his plan around the wrong version of her. By the time she reached the end of the cliff path and stood at the point where the rock dropped sheer to the water 30 feet below, the Portland countermotion had been filed. She knew this because Selin had sent a single word, done. She stood at the edge for a moment and let the wind take her breath and felt, for the first time in months, the particular and irreversible feeling of something set in motion that cannot be stopped. She was not euphoric. She was not triumphant. What she felt was something quieter and more important than either of those things. A settling, like the feeling of putting down a weight you've carried so long you've forgotten it wasn't part of your body. She would have to face Caspian. She would have to stand in the middle of the life he had built around her and dismantle it piece by piece in front of witnesses, in front of lawyers, possibly in front of his mother and his business partners and the 200 guests who had laughed at his toast. She would have to be very clear and very strong for whatever came next. But she had been preparing for this since March. She had been preparing, in a deeper sense, since an old woman in Kita had dipped a pen in ink and thought forward through time to this exact moment. She walked back to the estate. It was time. Caspian called at 2 in the afternoon from Portland. She was in the kitchen. His voice, when she answered, carried the particular controlled tension of a man who has received news he was not prepared for and has spent the drive to his next meeting organizing his response. I've received a filing notification from a Portland law firm. He paused. She said nothing. Do you know anything about this? Another pause, and she could hear in it the recalculation, the moment when a man who has been running a controlled operation realizes it may have slipped its leash. I hired an attorney, Nadia said. You mentioned getting legal review. I took your advice. The silence on his end was 3 full seconds. This filing references the Ghana land dispute. His voice had dropped. The performance quality was gone. What was left underneath was something she had heard only twice before, in the call she had recorded, when he spoke to his own lawyer without the warmth turned on. This was the real voice. Flat, precise, faintly dangerous. Yes, she said. It does. Nadia. He said her name the way people say the name of something that has become unexpectedly complicated. We should talk. I think we should, she said. Come home. He arrived at 6. She had spent the afternoon in the kitchen, cooking, not for comfort, but for the particular steadiness that comes from doing something with your hands that requires attention. She made jollof rice, the way her mother made it, with tomato paste and bay leaves and the long, aromatic patience of a pot left to simmer over low heat until the rice absorbs everything and becomes something better than any of its parts. The smell of it filled the kitchen and moved through the house, and she thought that if Caspian found this domestic, that was fine. She was past caring what he found. He walked in to find her at the stove and Leonora at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, because Leonora had not left for Portland as planned and had instead spent the day in the East guest room and then the kitchen, reading, and had made no move to remove herself. The presence of Leonora was not part of Nadia's plan. But it was, she had decided, not unwelcome. Caspian saw his mother at the kitchen table and stopped in the doorway. His face moved through several things very quickly. Sit down, Caspian, Leonora said. Her voice was the voice of a woman who has spent 67 years in rooms full of powerful men and has long ago stopped being impressed by any of them, including the one she raised. He sat. Nadia turned from the stove. She had the manila folder from her safe under one arm, the one containing the rescission letter and the documentation she had compiled over 8 months. She set it on the table between them. She sat down across from him. She did not open the folder yet. She looked at him instead, and he looked at her, and for the first time in 2 years the performance was gone from both sides, and what was left between them was simply the truth, which was ugly and real and relieving in the particular way that ugly truths always are once they are allowed to sit in the open. "You chose me for the land," she said. It was not a question. He was quiet for a long moment. Leonora wrapped her hands around her teacup. Outside, the ocean moved. "Yes," Caspian said. The word fell into the kitchen with the weight of something that had been held too long. He said it without apology and without drama, which was, she thought, at least honest. He was past pretending. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the absence of the usual managed warmth. He was a man looking at a situation that had moved outside his control and was assessing the damage. The development was worth $80 million over 10 years, he said. The land was the last piece. He looked at the folder on the table. "How long have you known?" "Since March," she said. She watched him recalculate the timeline, 8 months of her apparent compliance reordered around the knowledge she had been carrying. He had been operating on the assumption that she was unaware. Every move he had made in 8 months, the escalating pressure, Dahlia's presence, the anniversary party, the settlement offer with its buried clause, had been made against the backdrop of a woman who did not know what was happening. The settlement had been designed specifically to close the land dispute. She had known all of it. She had let him move. She had been building the counter. "The documents I signed at the wedding lunch," she said. "The power of attorney is flawed. Mama Abina's rider clause requires my mother's witness signature. It was never obtained." Something moved across his face, not quite surprise, but the specific expression of a man recognizing that a problem he thought he had solved has in fact never been solved. "My attorney," he started. "Your attorney drafted the transfer under Ghanaian law but executed it without proper local witness verification," Nadia said. "Kwame Asante identified it in March. The challenge has been in the Ghanaian courts for 5 months. There is also a Portland countermotion filed today referencing the settlement offer as evidence of coercion in a property dispute." She opened the folder. She laid the documents across the table one at a time. The original transfer instrument with Kwame's annotations, the rider clause in Mama Abina's handwriting, the recording transcript, the timeline. She laid them in order, precise and clear, the way she had once organized legal documents for NGO contracts in Accra, with the care of someone who knows that documents are the architecture of the truth. Caspian looked at each one without touching them. His face had gone very still. She could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. The shape of it, the assessment of exposure. The eco-resort project. The development consortium. His position in it. $80 million, frozen. "The consortium will pull their stake," he said finally. His voice was very flat. "Probably," she agreed. She did not say it with satisfaction. She had moved, months ago, past the stage where this was about satisfaction. It was simply true. Leonora stood from the table and walked to the counter and refilled her cup and stood with her back to the room for a moment. When she turned around, her face was composed, but there was something raw in it. The particular grief of a mother who has watched a child become something she did not intend. "What do you want?" she asked. It was unclear whether she was asking Nadia or Caspian. "I want the transfer instruments voided," Nadia said. "All 3 documents, cancelled, and the Kita land restored to my sole beneficial ownership. I want the development consortium informed that the land is not and was not legally available for the project. And I want to leave." She said the last part quietly, not with anger, with the clean, unadorned simplicity of a woman stating a fact. Caspian was looking at the documents on the table. She wondered, briefly, whether he had ever really looked at her, or whether she had always been, to him, only the land she sat between him and. She thought she knew the answer. She did not need him to confirm it. She left him with the documents and walked up the stairs for the last time with her spine straight and her hands steady, and she began to pack. She had done a quiet version of this weeks ago, consolidating the things that mattered, preparing for the reality of departure, but this was the true packing, the one that counted. She took her books, the ones from the north-facing room, the ones Mrs. Birch had boxed. She took Mama Abina's photo, which she had kept on the bedside table in a small silver frame. She took the laminated West African map. Below, she could hear Caspian's voice, one measured sentence, and Leonora's voice in response. By the time she had packed 2 bags, it was 9 o'clock. The jollof rice had been sitting on low heat for 3 hours and was perfect. She went downstairs and served it into 3 bowls because she was, fundamentally, a person who fed people. She set the bowls on the kitchen table and sat down. After a moment, Leonora and Caspian sat down too. They ate in silence. It was the first honest meal they had ever shared. The week that followed was the worst and the most necessary of Nadia's life. The Portland countermotion triggered a cascade that moved faster than she had anticipated, not because she had miscalculated, but because Caspian's exposure was larger than even she had known. 2 days after the anniversary party, Marcus Obi published the story. It ran first on his West African business news platform and was then picked up by 3 U.S. outlets with existing interest in Pacific Coast development disputes. The headline was measured, but the content was specific: a documented account of the Osei land dispute, the fraudulent transfer instruments, the marriage timeline, and the secondary signature extraction recording transcript. Obi had done his work carefully, building the story over 4 months from the materials Nadia had provided through Kwame's introduction, and the result was a piece of journalism that was factual, detailed, and impossible to ignore. The development consortium, 5 investors who had committed their capital to a project whose central land asset was now the subject of legal proceedings in 2 jurisdictions, received the article the same morning Caspian's attorney received formal notification of the Ghanaian court's preliminary ruling. The ruling supported the challenge. The transfer was flagged as procedurally irregular pending full hearing. Caspian called 3 times in the first 24 hours. Nadia did not answer. She was in the north-facing room, her room, the small one with the bad light, sitting on the floor with her back against the desk, her phone on her knee, watching the notifications multiply. Yemi was in the room with her, sitting cross-legged against the opposite wall, scrolling through the coverage with a face doing its best not to show how satisfying it found everything. Selin Aiden called at noon to confirm that Caspian's attorney had responded to the Portland filing with a request to delay proceedings, a standard move, predictable, and one for which Selin had already prepared a counter that would be filed by 4 o'clock. The delay request was denied. By evening, the development consortium had released a brief statement noting that they were monitoring the situation. This was the language of organizations that had already decided and were managing the announcement. Caspian knew it. She knew he knew it because on the second voicemail he left, the one she did not answer, his voice had something in it that was not controlled. It was not quite fear, but it was adjacent to it. The voice of a man watching an $80 million project dissolve. Dahlia came on the 3rd day. Not to the estate, to the cafe in town, where Nadia had been using a corner table as her base, working with Yemi and her laptop in what felt like a field command post. Dahlia arrived at 11 in the morning in a dark coat, carrying 2 coffees, and sat down at the table across from Nadia without being invited. She set 1 coffee in front of Nadia. Yemi looked at Nadia. Nadia looked at Dahlia. "I want to make it clear," Dahlia said, with the directness of someone who has spent the night deciding what they need to say, "that I was not aware of the specifics of the land transfer until 2 months ago." Nadia waited. "Caspian told me the land rights had been settled through standard marital property procedures. He didn't tell me how." She paused. "He used people," Dahlia continued, and her voice had something in it that Nadia recognized because she had heard it in her own voice, months ago in a cafe, sitting with cold coffee and the full understanding of what had been done. "He used people and he let them believe they were choosing." It was the most honest thing Dahlia had ever said in this room. Nadia held the coffee between both hands and let the warmth reach her palms. "You knew about the affair," Nadia said. It was not an accusation. Just a fact, spoken cleanly. Dahlia looked at her coffee cup. "Yes. And you came here 3 weeks ago knowing that?" "Yes." The pause. "I'm not asking for absolution," Dahlia said, and to her credit, she didn't sound like she was. She sounded like someone in the specific discomfort of sitting across from a person they have helped to wrong. I'm telling you that the recording you filed, the one about the extraction, I was on that call. I pushed back. He didn't listen. I should have gone further. I didn't. Nadia held this information for a moment. She thought about what it cost a woman to sit down across from another woman she had wronged and say this without softening it into something more manageable. She thought about the ways women are set against each other by men who move between them without cost. She thought about Mama Abina, who had built a wall against exactly this kind of cost. She picked up the coffee Dahlia had brought her. The consortium has already decided, she said. You should talk to your own lawyer. Dahlia nodded. I have been. She paused. I'm sorry. Nadia looked at her. I know, she said. And she did. Leonora called on the 4th day. She was in Portland at a hotel, and she spoke in the quiet voice of someone who has been sitting with something large and is now ready to set it down. She told Nadia she had spoken to the family attorney, not Caspian's transactional attorney, but the older family lawyer who had managed Leonora's own estate documents for 30 years. She told Nadia she was prepared to provide a formal statement confirming that she had been informed of the land transfer's nature before the marriage and had not disclosed this. A statement that would support the fraudulent misrepresentation claim and that would, in all probability, seal the case. Nadia sat with the phone pressed against her ear and felt the weight of what Leonora was offering. It was the kind of act that costs the person who performs it much more than it saves them. A mother testifying against her own son's character, in writing, in a legal proceeding. Why? Nadia asked. Leonora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, because your grandmother built you a door. Someone needs to make sure it opens. The line was quiet. Outside the cafe window, the October sea moved under a gray sky. Thank you, Nadia said. It was not enough. And it was everything. Caspian arrived at the estate on the 5th day with his attorney and a new set of documents. Nadia was not there. She had asked Mrs. Birch, who had shown, in the past week, a remarkable willingness to receive information and act on it, in ways suggesting she had been watching this marriage with more intelligence than anyone had credited, to inform Mr. Vane that his wife's attorney was handling all communications and that he could direct any further proposals accordingly. Selin told her afterward that Caspian's new set of documents included a revised settlement, one that had dropped the land dispute clause and now simply offered the Saltmere estate and a cash settlement in exchange for Nadia's agreement not to pursue the fraud claim. It was a better offer by far. It was also a concession, an acknowledgement, in legal language, that the original position was indefensible. She did not accept it, because Kwame and Selin agreed that the Ghanaian proceedings were almost certain to produce a full ruling in her favor within the month, and a ruling was cleaner than a settlement. But she noted the concession. It meant the consortium had pulled their stake. It meant the 80 million was gone. It meant Caspian had looked at what she had built over 8 months and understood, finally, that the woman he had married to break was not, in fact, the woman he had married. On the 6th day, she went back to the estate to collect her remaining things. She arrived in the late morning to find it empty, Caspian gone, Mrs. Birch away for the day, the house quiet with the particular silence of a place that has been recently vacated. She walked through the white rooms slowly, not with grief, but with a kind of clear-eyed assessment. She had lived here for 2 years and she had been, in this house, a diminished version of herself. The books in boxes. The map removed. The north-facing room with its bad light. The 1,000 small erasures. She stood in the center of the main room where the ocean light fell cold and pale across the stone floor, and she let herself feel all of it one last time, not to linger in it, but to acknowledge it. What had been done to her? What she had survived? What she had built inside the survival? Then she picked up her bags and walked to the front door and out into the October cold. The cliff path curved away to the right. She took the left fork, which led to the road, and walked to where Yemi was waiting in a rented car, engine running, ready. She did not look back. The Ghanaian court issued its full ruling in November, 3 weeks after Nadia arrived in Accra. The ruling was 5 pages long and written in the formal language of property law, but its meaning was simple and complete. The 3 documents signed at the wedding lunch were found to be procedurally invalid, executed under misrepresentation of their nature, and without the legally required witness as mandated by Mama Abina's rider clause. The beneficial interest in the Kita shoreline was hereby confirmed in the sole name of Nadia Osei. Not Nadia Vane. Nadia Osei. The name she had carried since before him, the name her grandmother had planted forward in time to meet her here. She read the ruling at the kitchen table in her mother's house in Accra, with Efua beside her and Yemi across from her and tea going cold at each of their elbows, and when she finished reading she set it flat on the table and placed her palms against the warm wood and breathed in the smell of her mother's kitchen, groundnut soup simmering on the stove, the sweet dusty smell of the October harmattan coming through the open window, pepper from the clay pots on the front porch. She was home. She was entirely herself. She let herself feel it, the weight that had been lifted, the space that had opened where the weight had been. Efua had not said, "I told you once." This was the thing that Nadia would think about later, when she was further from the worst of it, that her mother, who had pressed a sudsy hand to her wrist in a kitchen and told her to ask what the room contained, had never once said, "I told you." What she had said, on the evening Nadia arrived home from Saltmere with 2 bags and a folder of legal documents and the particular kind of tired that lives behind the eyes, was, "You're home." And she had made tea, the strong, sweet kind that Mama Abina used to make, and she had sat with Nadia at the kitchen table and listened, and when the story was told she had been quiet for a long time, and then she had said, "She knew about men who take land from women. She knew you might love before you had the weapons to protect what you love. So she gave you the weapons in advance." Nadia had thought about this for weeks afterward. About a woman who grew pepper in clay pots and amended a land document at the age of 88, thinking forward through time with the particular love of someone who will not live to see what they are protecting against but protects nonetheless. The Portland fraud claim proceeded more slowly, measured by the different rhythms of American civil proceedings, but Selin was unhurried and thorough, and by December, Caspian's attorney had accepted a consent decree acknowledging the misrepresentation without requiring trial. The decree was public record. It named the events, the documents, and the timeline with a specificity that was its own kind of acknowledgement. The Development Consortium had released its statement 2 weeks after pulling their stake, noting that the Kita land was not available for development, that the representation of its availability had been inaccurate, and that the consortium had consequently withdrawn from the project. In the language of corporate statements, this was measured. In the language of consequences, it was devastating. Caspian's position inside the consortium had depended entirely on his ability to deliver the land. That position was gone. The 3 investors who had committed capital were not publicly angry. They were the kind of quietly angry that is more durable than noise. In Caspian's industry, that quality of anger had a long memory. Leonora's formal statement was filed in Portland on December 2nd. Nadia read it for the first time 3 days later in Kwame's office, in a building in Lab 1 with a ceiling fan and a view of a courtyard where someone was washing a motorcycle in the afternoon light. The statement was 4 paragraphs. It was precise and unsparing, and Nadia could hear, in the careful sentence structure, the effort it had cost to write the truth about her own son in a legal document. She sat with it for a long time. She thought about Leonora at the kitchen table saying, "I made him that way, in part." The courage of that sentence. The weight of it. She filed the statement with the Portland proceeding, and afterward she wrote Leonora a short handwritten letter, not about the case, but about the conversation in the kitchen. About the tea. About the quality of attention Leonora had paid her that afternoon, which was the first time anyone in that house had looked at her with genuine curiosity. She said, "You asked me questions no one in that house had thought to ask. That mattered. It still does." She posted it from the Lab 1 post office on a Wednesday. She did not know if Leonora would reply. But she had wanted to say it. Truth is not only a legal instrument. Sometimes it is a letter. In January, Nadia walked the Kita shoreline for the first time as its sole legal owner. Kwame drove her down from Accra in the early morning, 3 hours south on the coastal road, the harmattan dust orange in the headlights until the sun came up over the Atlantic and the dust turned gold. They arrived as the sky was still pale and the sea was loud and gray-green and alive. It was a long, flat stretch of coast, red-brown sand, coconut palms bent toward the water, fishing nets staked in the ground at intervals, the shapes of small boats in the morning mist. Not the luxury eco-resort backdrop of a developer's pitch deck. A real place. Lived in. Generational. She walked the 318 meters slowly, in the company of no one except Kwame at a respectful distance, and she felt the sand through her sandals and the wind off the water and the texture of a place that belongs to you not because you claimed it but because someone who loved you gave it forward into your hands. She walked to the waterline and stood there for a long time with her face into the wind. The Atlantic was cold and salt-bright and indifferent to any of it, to Caspian, to the consortium, to the legal proceedings, to the particular smallness of what men do when they are afraid of what they cannot control. It just kept moving. She did not develop the land. She had considered it, considered legitimate development partnerships with community input, a sustainable tourism model that would benefit the fishing families who had worked that stretch of coast for generations. She had discussed it with Kwame, with her mother, with the community leaders she met on the first visit. These conversations were ongoing, patient, shaped by the understanding that land is not a transaction but a relationship, and that what Mama Abina had given her was not a windfall but a responsibility. What she did in the first year was simpler. She established a legal community land trust, administered by a board that included herself, Kwame, 2 local fishermen's association representatives, and her mother. The trust provided legal protection for the community land rights that had always, unofficially, existed. It did what Mama Abina had always done with the land. It made it safe for the people who depended on it. It was quiet, unglamorous, and important. She began to write about it, for Kwame's NGO partner network, for Marcus Obi's platform, for a land rights policy journal whose editor had reached out after the Saltmere story broke. She found, in the writing, something she had always known she was. She did not hate Caspian. This surprised some people. Yemi, gently, raised an eyebrow when Nadia said so, but it was true. What she felt was harder to name and more durable than hate. She felt something like clarity. A precise and complete understanding of the ways a person can be designed against, the particular weaponry of seeming warmth and manufactured choice. She had been made to feel chosen when she was being selected. Made to feel seen when she was being assessed. The difference between those two things, between being loved and being acquired, was the most important thing she had learned, and she carried it not as bitterness but as knowledge. She wrote it, eventually, in an essay that went further than she had planned. About land and women. About the things grandmothers build with their hands into the future. About what stays when everything else leaves. The essay was read widely. It was translated into 4 languages. A woman in Lagos emailed to say she had read it the morning after leaving her husband. A woman in Oslo said she had read it to her daughter. Nadia read each message and thought about Mama Abina, who would not have known exactly what an essay was, but who would have understood without any difficulty what it meant to plant something in the earth and trust that it would grow forward into hands you could not yet see. That was what love was. Not possession. Not performance. Not a man who chose you for what you carried. Love was a woman in a small house in Kita, growing peppers, thinking forward in time, making sure the door would open.